morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our new Infrastructure Intelligence Live series of events, which we've organised in association with our strategic partner, BECG, who we're very happy to be working with throughout our autumn series of events. And I think it's fair to say that we're kicking off our events with quite an important topic, actually, on the subject of infrastructure delivery. There's obviously been a lot of talk in politics of late, talking about build, which is a great buzzword, and obviously one that people in the construction and infrastructure sector are really happy to hear about. But what we're interested in, and what we keep hearing through our social media, in the virtual pages of Infrastructure Intelligence, is very much about delivery. How are we going to deliver these infrastructure projects? How are we going to deliver them on time? How are we going to deliver them efficiently? How are we going to deliver what the nation needs? Because I think it's fair to say that maybe in the UK, certainly where politicians have got involved, they haven't had the best record as far as that's concerned. So we're going to chew the fat on those delivery issues. An excellent panel of speakers who I'm going to introduce in turn in a moment. But hopefully you'll enjoy today's event. If you have any questions for us all on the panel, then please post them in the chat box, and I will field those to our panelists or to the panel as a whole. So I'm sure as they speak, you will be prompted with specific questions. So just put them in the chat, and we'll ask those questions. Anyway, to kick things off, our first speaker today is Simon Kirby, who is an associate at the Nichols Group, a leading organisation, very, very active in the construction sector in the UK. And Simon's got vast experience working in our sector. Before joining the Nichols Group, he worked at HS2 for 3 years, and before then, he worked at Network Rail for over a decade, and the latter 2 years of that role as Managing Director of Infrastructure Projects. So I think it's fair to say that Simon knows his stuff when it comes to infrastructure delivery. So Simon, over to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Andy, and good morning, everyone. All my career has been in large-scale project delivery. So, Andy, I love the title, Deliver. And thanks for asking me to join. You've only given us 7 minutes to talk around how we can deliver projects faster. So I'll be brief and clearly want to bring everybody into the discussion. Infrastructure's prime purpose is to improve society and the economy. And given the massive impacts of COVID-19 has had, it's more important than ever. And its impact is more important. So whether it's schools, hospitals, transport, broadband, infrastructure, they can all stimulate the economy. But the challenge is clear. How do we do that faster? And many of us have been involved in projects where we just have to deliver them on time as quickly as possible, like the Nightingale hospitals, which is a fantastic example. But for me, whilst the comparisons flawed in some ways, many reasons that speed up delivery are comparable between that project and the sort of projects we're involved with. And as Andy said, within Nichols now, I get involved in a lot of strategic reviews of programs that, let's just say, haven't gone well. And also working with clients around how do we structure programs to learn from those looking forwards. So the question, how can we speed up performance and deliver? For me, there's no silver bullet, by the way, and I'm sure everybody tuning in didn't expect one. But looking at all those different reviews I've done and looking back, I believe there's 6 key components to any infrastructure project to improve delivery. The first is a clear vision. The second is clear and fixed client requirements. The third, diversity of leadership. I'll come back to these, by the way. The fourth, appropriate governance. The fifth, all about aligning objectives from the top right the way through the program. And the sixth is to predict and manage system integration. So let's start with the first one, a clear vision. Whether it's private or public sector, any successful project needs a clear vision and strategy. It's not easy and it needs a lot of engagement, but I see too often projects progressing without these clearly understood and fixed. Worse still, how many times do we see the same project relaunch? Once a vision's set, to be honest, politicians for me need to back out. They've done their bit and hold us to account as an industry for delivering what their vision sets out, but not keep dropping back in and changing the strategy or vision. They're not political comments, they're just a statement of what you see and what I've seen over my career. If that happens, frankly, you never get out of the development phase. So the second, clear and fixed client requirements. Fixed being the vital word. No matter what you're delivering, if the client requirements keep changing at the highest level, the project will be late and will be over budget. And if that's the case, in my experience, to be honest, the hardest thing to do, but the most important thing to do, if the requirements are moving, is stop at that stage of a project until you can get that clarity back. That pays dividends later in terms of delivery. So we have a clear vision, clear requirements. The third is diverse leadership. And this in itself is probably a whole subject of a webinar, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But for me, this is a massive opportunity for us. It's broad. It doesn't mean hiring just experienced people. Modern programs have so much complexity in them in terms of systems, technology. It can't be down to one person leading it. It's about creating high-performing, diverse teams that embrace the complexity and deliver. Quite simply, we must attract the best people we can to deliver our challenges and deliver. And we need a balance of experience and diverse new thinking. The fourth is appropriate governance, which sounds a bit dull, but for me, it's arguably one of the most important ones. Governance should be as lean as it can be to safely deliver the requirements of a program. Now, that's pretty obvious, to be honest. So why do I continually see governance based on adding in process every time something goes wrong? A lot of governance I look at today is simply no longer fit for purpose. We're great as an industry at building in more and more governance. I rarely see organizations step back and look at the full picture and just say, this is too complex. We cannot run a program with this complexity. I would say it's probably better in privately funded programs that I get involved with and far worse in publicly funded programs, but rarely is it lean. The fifth is aligned objectives, and programs that deliver have a clear line of sight from the vision, the funder, right the way through the supply chain to the people on the ground delivering the project. I spent a lot of my career as a client, and I would always say it's the client's responsibility to create that right aligned supply chain in a very collaborative way. As a client, I would never tolerate people blaming suppliers. We choose the suppliers, we create the environment and the culture of the program to work collaboratively with them. So that's very much down to the client. And the sixth, which is probably relatively new as an issue in the last maybe 5, maybe 10 years, is predicting and managing complexity in terms of system integration. I often see complex system-based programs focusing too much on civil engineering aspects. I can say that as an engineer and a fellow of the civil engineers, so there you go. But modern programs have huge system complexity in them, whether it's building control systems, remote monitoring, train control systems, whatever they are, they require program system integration. And I see clients too often thinking that as purely a technical challenge. It isn't. It's about understanding the risks and building those risks into the program. And when decisions are made, you understand the risks and complexity. And it's very easy to say Crossrail is an obvious example because it's public, but believe me, I see many others. So they're my 6 points to start the discussion. I'm not sure how close I got to the 7 minutes, but there's a lot, I think, to discuss. Now, I'm happy to talk around those 6 points. I think for me, the challenge is they're kind of obvious. How do we do it? I believe we waste probably about 50% of time on programs as a result of the issues I've covered. Indeed, international benchmarks I've looked at in a number of areas do support that. But to end on a positive, I think, yeah, COVID's been obviously horrific, but a real positive from a boosting the economy perspective going forward is infrastructure. And we have a challenge from government who appear to have a need. They appear to need action, so the pull's there. And I believe we can do this. It's about reflecting and really being honest with ourselves. We can do better. So lots to discuss. Andy, back to you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Some very interesting points there that, as you said yourself, I'm sure we will return to in the discussion. I mean, some very interesting issues there around lean governance, about politicians getting out of the way. Good luck with that. But, you know, I think it'll be interesting having a conversation about how the industry responds to what the politicians are actually calling for, particularly when the, I was going to say, differing interests, sometimes vested interests that they have come into play. So again, a lot to discuss there, I'm sure. Our next speaker is David Weisel. And David is the Managing Director for UK Infrastructure at Turner & Townsend, and he leads Turner & Townsend's UK infrastructure team, as well as supporting their global and regional leadership teams. In his current role, he's focused on helping the UK infrastructure become fit to deliver the pipeline that it has ahead of it. And I know that he's currently involved in a number of different projects and schemes, which in his own words, I think, are delivering some of the most exciting infrastructure programs ever undertaken in the UK. So I'm really looking forward to listening to what David's got to say and his observations on this whole question of infrastructure delivery. So David, over to you.
Andy, thank you. Thank you for that rather big build up there. No pressure. Morning, everyone. Good to be able to join you. Funnily enough, you might see some synergies in what Simon said. I had the benefit of going second, so I had 6 points as well to talk about, but I've added a 7th now because I had time to think. But I want to start with, I think we're at where Simon finished actually, before I go into specific points. Infrastructure has perhaps never been in the limelight and the kind of the real kind of focus of the UK as it is now. You know, if you look at the big UK challenges, economic recovery post-COVID, absolutely. The social progression and the levelling up agenda the government have got, through to, of course, carbon net zero. Infrastructure plays the heart of that. So, you know, what an opportunity, firstly, to absolutely galvanise our industry. We talk about diverse talent, as Simon talked about, and bringing talent in. Well, now's our time. So I think we've all got to think about how we use that backdrop of where we are as a real magnet for industry overall. I think, secondly, before going into the specifics, I think we should pat ourselves on the back a little bit. You know, last 6 months have been tough for many organisations, and I'm sure people on this call. Stresses and strains all over the place through supply chains, clients as well, and in my business as well. But you stand back now and maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel. There's been some real positive things happen in their industry. I think the work from CLC has been very good. I think we've seen in the infrastructure market some responses from key clients. I'll pull out the Environment Agency, Network Rail, Highways England, who actually have sped up projects. They have actually come through and invested. And certainly for my business across the UK, it's been pretty critical for us, you know, to keep moving forward and keep people deployed and supporting them. But I think there's been some real you know, benefits, and I think we should kind of, you know, recognise actually, you know, what's happening to some of the big clients. Some big things also I've seen, you know, in the last kind of few months in particular, there's been a sense of real collaboration. You know, perhaps 10 years ago it would have been a bit more transactional. I generally think there's been a real sense of collaboration where clients and supply chains have come together to understand the problem, understand productivity, impacts, work solutions, which has been great to see. I think a lot of clients are now looking at accelerating things they may have been talking about for a number of years quicker, you know, agile client models, different delivery models. It's now, let's get them into play, which is great to see. And I think this kind of holy grail of alignment of outcomes and real purpose, sense of purpose, is now really crystallizing, which is, again, it's great to see. I think there is you know, maybe a risk for the industry we should be aware of. I think, you know, a lot of the mega projects, a lot of the regulated industries have set up baselines pre-COVID that we've now got to understand the impact of COVID, then overcome challenges. We saw, I think I saw some data there, you know, we saw productivity challenges and improvement areas around 20% at least. I'll come back to that. We think COVID's added probably another 15% on top of that in terms of restrictions and ways of working. So, you know, how can the industry really retain confidence in delivery performance and delivery performance really in a way that can continue to demonstrate confidence back into government and obviously infrastructure users out there. It's critical we do that. In terms of specific areas around deliver with faster pace, my thoughts, number one, again, connected to what Simon talked about, let's start with government. We've got to get real, we've got to get consistency around how projects are set up, the gateways, the assurance, the strategy. I had a call this morning with a major client in the UK from the energy sector who's sitting there saying, I want to recruit lots of people and get on with this, but there's no government white paper on this energy strategy. I'm still waiting for it. You know, how can we get certainty? We've got to start with government and put pressure on to give that certainty. Where's the national infrastructure strategy that responds to John Armitt's work? Secondly, I am passionate about project and program setup. You know, we tend to start, and again, Simon will know more than me about this, but with a kind of blank canvas on major projects sometimes. And, you know, we don't tend to be an industry that really reflects, learns and builds from one to another. We've got to get better at learning. There's been some great work by the IPA, their route map work, but I don't think the industry's taken it up in the way it should have done. I know that they're looking at a kind of revision 2 at the moment. Out of the Construction Innovation Hub with Keith Waller, there's some great work on the value toolkit. And again, that's a great tool to think about set up a project and how you procure for value, I think should be used. But let's get those into the ways of working, and let's really kind of as an industry use them and get a framework that's consistent and common. Thirdly, as a humble QS here, I think a step change in procurement capability is a big area. You know, it pains me to say, I think the procurement capability in lots of places isn't good enough. I think we've got to put some pragmatism into how we procure. We've got to speed up procurement processes. We've got to simplify commercial processes. We've got to think about how we can, you know, construct supply chains for capability and not commercial, complex commercial arrangements that actually you spend so much time just got to understand and manage against. It's got to be capability led. So a lot of work around streamlining procurement process and thinking. 4, I think consistency in delivery models. Again, you know, in the setup, yes, but how do we get delivery models that draw in the right capability? And you know, we tend to again have quite a civils dominated approach to how we construct delivery models, as again Simon touched on. How do we get lean, agile thinking into the heart of those delivery models? How do we get technology in the heart? I'm doing a lot of work in defence at the moment, and the way they think about logistics, the way they think about data science is a step beyond what I call core infra, and I think we can learn a lot. 5, in terms of delivery performance, I've said, you know, we were doing some analysis on pre-COVID productivity levels, and we think, you know, at least 20% betterment we could drive for across the industry. 8% in how people are managed on site, sometimes there's too many, too few. 5% in better design management information. 4% better planning. 2 in how materials and equipment's moved around. 1% in managing stakeholders. 1% in the good old British weather. But you can't really change that. But you know, how do we tackle those big buckets together with the supply chain? How we think about improvement areas there? Of course, the big holy grail is MMC and offsite, but that's going to take time. I think there's some low-hanging fruit there we can look at as industry to drive improvement in getting pace into product delivery. And again, just what Simon said, start with the end in mind. You know, get the operator, the user absolutely at the forefront of project setup and thinking. The end in mind, you know, is absolutely critical. But I think overall, Andy, look, I'm positive. As I said, I think we're on a platform for infrastructure going forward. It's great. I think it's exciting times ahead if we can get the branding industry right, attract talent in. But I do think that kind of concept of being a much more open-minded learning industry is a big one, and how we can collaborate around the learning agenda and keep moving forward. Back to you.
Thanks very much, David. Again, some, I think, really important points, which I know that we will return to. And we've already got some questions coming in the chat box. So please keep sending your questions through this whole concept of industry improvement, learning from each other, and also some interesting points about branding of the industry, of the sector, and how do we attract the new talent in the future. I mean, I think in a post-COVID environment, the effect of all of that on industry and business, I think the construction sector is going to be even more challenged to make sure that it can actually attract new people to work in the sector. And I think we're going to have to up our game even more. We already had to, of course, before all of this, and I think we're going to have to do it even more in the future to make this an industry where people really want to come and work. And I know that Jamie Gordon, who's going to speak last, his role in working with organisations on their profile and on their comms will undoubtedly have something to say about that particular about that's to come. Our next speaker is Rachel Skinner, who's the Executive Director and the UK Head of Transport at WSP. Rachel has spoken at infrastructure intelligence webinars in the past extremely eloquently on the issue of the whole strategic approach towards infrastructure delivery. And I know that Rachel has a lot of experience, including in some of the areas that I just mentioned on profile, but also, if you like, in looking at the future of the industry and where the industry is going to go as we move forward, and how we're going to deliver some of these projects and how we're going to work differently as well. So without further ado from me, it's over to Rachel to speak next. Rachel.
Thanks, Andy. I should just say I've got somebody at the door, so if you hear another persistent knock, I might have to just go and sort that out, but hopefully they'll leave it on the doorstep. No, thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Fantastic. So I've come at this this morning from a slightly different viewpoint, I guess, reflecting largely what Andy's just said there. I kind of tried to stand back a bit and kind of look at our industry as a whole and think perhaps less about the, if you like, the process of the delivery models and a bit more about the what and the how and the why and that kind of thing. So it struck me when I was just having a think about this the other day that the really easy option here in terms of trying to kind of escape out of COVID-19 is just to kind of do a bit of a turtle into shell act and just kind of make loads of excuses why we can't deliver as we plan, it's too difficult, the funding's really tricky, there's too much uncertainty, and use all of that as reasons why we can't really get on as we wanted to at the moment, except where things are frankly too far along to kind of stop. We could do that. But of course, that's a fast ticket to exactly nowhere and is not helpful to government. It's not helpful to ourselves as an industry and so on. So clearly not very sensible. The kind of middle option, I guess, is just to try and get back to how we used to do stuff and sort of, you know, heads down, work hard, figure out the funding, get back to normal, if you like. But I think probably the hardest option, but probably by far the best option, is to try our very best through this whole kind of COVID uncertainty period to keep the wheels turning in terms of delivery and use COVID as a bit of a springboard or a platform to jump forward lots of steps and start to deliver really differently in terms of what we do. So I completely agree with some of the points we've already heard. I mean, David's point around collaboration just now really struck a chord, which is great. There's a desire to get on and you know, and work as a team to make sure we really keep things going along, as I say. But I think we kind of need to take stock, and then we need to aim high if we really want to make a significant difference going forward and improve our visibility and our profile, our relevance, be attractive to the next generation, as we've just been hearing. I think all of those points are utterly critical. So then when I thought about that a little bit more, I've kind of broken it into three stages. I think there's some stuff we can do in the short term around delivery. I think there's some stuff we can do in the medium term. And then I think there's a need to keep an eye through all of that on the long run in terms of actually what we're trying to achieve, where we're going, the outcome piece, again, I guess as Simon mentioned a few minutes ago. So coming back to the short term bit, to me, there's some really obvious stuff out there right now in terms of capturing and locking in some of the changes in behaviour we've already seen and that we really want to keep. There are a couple of things in particular that I think we can be pretty confident around right now. The first one is the active travel piece, you know, to do with some small scale schemes as well as the really big stuff. You know, we've got all this money being pumped into things to do with emergency active travel funds and active travel and so on. We know that people have responded in their droves in terms of, you know, changing the way they move around, that kind of thing, and connecting into their local communities in different ways to the way they used to. Why on earth don't we do the necessary things in terms of infrastructure to really lock that in hard and make sure that continues being part of the picture from now on? Because frankly, it's what we've been trying to do for 20 years in terms of transport policy, certainly. The other piece that I think we can be pretty sure is going to be carrying on, certainly in terms of a priority over the coming year, if not more, depending on how long it takes us to get away from the tentacles of COVID, I guess, is around the ongoing need for really good quality digital connections. And again, the infrastructure piece that goes around that. We've been talking for ages, for years, haven't we, around the need to improve fibre connections and the speed of connectivity in terms of the wired networks, but also, of course, more recently to do with 4G, 5G and so on, and the need to get the wireless pieces working. I think now will be a really smart time to think hard and quickly about how we start to lock that piece in as well. I think beyond that, in terms of short-term We need to absolutely take advantage of new working patterns, new movement patterns and so on. Make sure we're providing for them. There's lots of talk around, people are looking around the world, looking at things like 15-minute cities and so on. I'm not suggesting we might do that entirely here, but there are definitely ways through infrastructure to kind of support and underpin change in terms of places all over the country, urban and rural, that now have new potential to thrive. And I think there's a really exciting piece coming through in terms of the rural communities, perhaps places that might have missed out a bit in the past, because actually, although we can't do everything everywhere, there will be loads of new opportunities that come through to deliver better for people living in those sorts of places. I think, though, on the flip side, we need to really support the city centres, because we can see it, can't we? We can certainly see it in London. We can see it in some of the other major centres around the country. We're going to need some serious thinking and some quick thinking around planning ahead for, what are these cities going to become? And I think we need to remember that all of these places have existed for far longer than we've had the various infrastructure networks that we now rely on to sort of get around every day and connect in and all the rest of it. But on the one hand, we're all saying we don't want to return to the peak commuter crush in some cases that we all used to just tolerate and almost take for granted in a negative way. But at the same time, how are we going to use these spaces? How are we going to help them to thrive and so on? There's some really short-term things, but if we get them right, they become part of a bigger picture. Coming on to the medium-term side of things, I think clearly we absolutely do need to keep the big projects alive. A lot of what I was just saying before is around smaller stuff as well as bigger, but I think we do need to keep that bedrock of some of the bigger things where we know that they're fully justified going through the system and not sort of accidentally taking a time out, I guess, in terms of some of those. But I think the way we go about it needs to change quite fundamentally. We know that in terms of the way we've made decisions generally as an industry and in terms of the political and the funding decisions that go on, that largely to now, things have been focused on the economic really case in terms of, what's the BCR, right? Okay, yes, that can happen or not happen. But there are things that we haven't built into that process that we now need to think about much more. And I guess there I'm thinking in particular around carbon, and I'm thinking also around the social justice piece, the levelling up piece, because I think on the one hand you have the tagline of build, 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 and the usual undercurrent there is faster, better, greener in the sort of the traditional style of our current government of everything has to be 3 words and has to be memorable and so on. So the faster, better, greener challenge I think is one that we as an industry could absolutely grab and run with, because I think yes, there are pieces around faster, but faster isn't everything. We need to think really hard about the other 2 aspects as well. So on carbon very quickly, and I think to be clear about that, I'm not just talking about that being the greener bit. I think it could be faster and also better as well in terms of carbon too. We need to think about how we measure the carbon all the way through the process of doing our infrastructure projects, from design through construction right into operation. We need to get far more conscious about that. We need to actually think about how that works and weave it into the bigger picture. We need to think about codes and skills and standards and rattle forward in terms of how we do that better. And we need to think about the whole system in terms of the whole life impact of the things that we actually create. And on the social justice piece, the levelling up piece and so on, actually I think this is a key part of that better in terms of the faster, better, greener, but it could also be part of cheaper, which is interesting because you avoid other costs, long run, unintended consequences. Actually, if you think about how you benefit far wider segments of the community. I think we've been doing some really interesting work recently where we start to make use of data sources and really think about the granular populations that we're actually affecting in terms of the different schemes that are coming through. Because I think very often perhaps we've been guilty in the past of looking out there and kind of treating the people who will benefit from a project or a scheme or whatever it might be, a program, saying that it's just this amorphous mass of people, when actually it's not. Each of those communities are made up of specific groups of people and they do have different characteristics. And if we think really hard about how we do that and actually make best use of the data, we could, without overcomplicating things, deliver things very differently and with far greater and wider benefits for everybody involved. I guess the good news on all of that is that it does feel that there should be plenty of nudges coming our way from government around both of those carbon and the social or the levelling up agendas. There is apparently work ongoing in terms of both of those, in terms of the next iteration of the Green Book and, if you like, the rules of play in terms of how we go about investing and making decisions. But obviously we are all waiting on tenterhooks, I guess, to figure out what that actually means. But I think as an industry, what we can all do for ourselves is we need to do everything we can to influence the funders, the investors, the decision makers and so on, so that we do actually make those decisions and make progress rather than just going around in one slow big circle and ending up back where we started, having not actually decided to build anything at all, because there is a risk there that we could overcomplicate things if we're not careful. I guess the good news on that is it does feel a little bit that we all, in kind of a societal sense, we do seem to have a newfound level of respect, I would say, for our infrastructure systems out of COVID. And I suspect we could play on that quite heavily if we wanted to. I think there are a lot of things that in the past we've sort of complained generically, haven't we, over the years about how, you know, we're taken for granted except when things go wrong and all that kind of thing. And I think actually through these kind of crisis months and so on, it has been seen that in fact some of the stuff we do is pretty important, and people are fairly grateful that we've kept stuff running and moving and so on. You know, whether you're talking about energy or water or transport or digital or whatever it might be, all those different things. So just finally, I guess, coming on to the long run side of things, and this isn't really about things you don't consider now and you only start thinking about in the long run. It's more around the direction of travel and the need to keep that long run outcome in mind in my head. It feels to me that quite a lot of the big picture stuff, the really big outcomes we're after, actually haven't been affected by COVID because they were there before. It's just a case of just remembering them and bringing them through in much more detail. So we know we want, you know, I guess if you sort of take the big national picture and indeed beyond that, you know, everybody wants thriving communities, healthy communities, a decent quality of life. They all want, you know, we all want to be doing things in a way that doesn't harm natural systems around us, ultimately the planet and so on. And hopefully we're going to see all of that woven into whatever the government response becomes to the national infrastructure assessment and that formation of a strategy, as David was just saying. That would be really helpful, I think, because actually we do know what we want, and it's just a case of trying to find ways of bringing that through across all of our different sectors. So I guess overall, our task, I guess, is to find ways of building all of that in from now and carrying those threads through into the short and the medium term stuff that we're going to have to do anyway, so that we actually do head off in that right long term direction. And I guess implicit within that, and coming back to the two people we've already heard from, I suppose, is we have actually got to deliver well and quite overtly against all those promises we've made, because that's the way to build visibility and trust for the future and to attract new talent into our industry as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that. I was particularly interested in what you said there about having a greater focus on collaboration going forward, and also this concept of not using COVID as an excuse, because we may well return to that in the discussion, because there are obviously other stakeholders within the sector, you know, who you know, may well look at COVID as an excuse to do certain things. And of course, that's not collaboration. And we need to make sure that we do come together as an industry. And I think the other point you made, which really struck me, is the fact that, if you like, infrastructure you know, has come to the fore in relation to this particular crisis. And I think on the whole, our infrastructure, in terms of, you know, with a capital I, has actually worked. I mean, I'm not talking about testing infrastructure and some of the other stuff that's in the news at the moment. I mean, I'm down into this call from the Northeast, where we've just been put on another sort of mini lockdown, although it's not a lockdown as a whole. But there's a lot of that going on. And we even heard on the news this morning, didn't we, that there might well be. So just when we thought that we were starting to come out of some of this, we're now in a different situation. And I think obviously the ability of infrastructure as a sector and as a deliverable to actually flex into that situation, I think is going to be really important going forward. And it'll be interesting having some conversation on that as well, because we are, as many people have said over the past couple of months, living in extremely interesting and challenging times for all organisations, and obviously the infrastructure sector is not immune from that as well. Anyway, our next speaker and final panelist speaker is Jamie Gordon, who is the Director for Infrastructure and Energy at the Strategic Communications Consultancy, BECG. And Jamie leads BECG's work, obviously, as his title implies, in the energy and infrastructure sector, and he advises clients on getting their message across, on how to communicate and market what they're doing. And he's currently working on a number of reasonably high profile projects, including the green energy sector, high speed rail and highways. And I'm sure Jamie, who I have heard speak before, will be extremely informative on this issue of delivery, but also I think hopefully how can the industry better get its message across in what is, after all, challenging times. So Jamie, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Yeah, I mean, a lot of what's been said, even though I'm more of a comms person than an engineer or directly involved in that side of the business, a lot of being said links in with some of what I'm going to talk about today, because a lot was about communications. A lot was about the politicians behind what we need to do. And of course, build, they're great words. We've heard it before under different guises, great rhetoric. And economic rationale coming out of COVID's fairly obvious. But it's a bit like walking into the stock exchange and shouting buy, in the hope it will move the economy. We kind of need more details. We need more policy support. Otherwise, the brokers just would come clamming towards you, say, buy what, with what. And admittedly, the government did list a number of projects, but most of those were kind of already in the pipeline with very strong needs case. So realistically, great rhetoric, but nothing has changed. Now, of course, the with what question. Now, I'm not an economist. We're going into an economic freefall post-COVID. So funding does seem to be a bit tight, but I think anything to do with investing in an asset which remains in place well after it's paid off its cost base has to make straightforward common sense, and that can be supported through policy. We've seen policy change over the few years regarding, let's say, wind farm and the way with CFDs that can be funded. And offshore wind has gone ballistic off the back of that in the UK, and we're certainly now a sector leader. And as we know through COVID, we had days where we went totally fossil free, and that was assisted by the policies. And it's helping the politicians make the right macro-based policies rather than coming up and interfering with vanity ideas and the details, which is something that was alluded to early on by Simon. But it isn't only funding that's uncertainty. I mean, we're in strange times, and with COVID, it's pretty difficult to predict the future. I mean, Highways England, for instance, how do they calculate their business benefit cost ratio, BCRs, on traffic modelling when realistically, are people going to be driving to work 5 days a week post-COVID? It's all very much up in the air. And to be honest, as an industry, we've always been slightly risk averse for obvious reasons. I think we're all kind of frightened of becoming the next Dr. Beeching and doing something that's proven to be not future-proofed. And basically those kind of level of details, those kind of big market decisions have to come out of government policy. So if we have to build, what the government has to do is pass legislation that will support, deliver. And I mentioned wind farms before. That was a great piece of planning legislation, well, not so much planning legislation, but legislation and policy that helped that. We've obviously had the 2008 Planning Act giving us the DCO regime, which has been fantastic. I mean, there's no doubt if we had to go through the old Town and Country Planning Act, there'd still be billions of pounds languishing in local planning committees yet to be signed off. And they have indicated they're going to support. And there was the Infrastructure Delivery Task Force with Project Speed was announced on the same day as the big build statement. Unfortunately, if you type it into Google, you won't see anything since that statement, which was made back in June. We've also had, obviously, the National Infrastructure Strategy, which is being delayed more times than Tom Jones's retirement party, as far as I can work out. And recently, obviously, Wilfer pulled by the developer because of lack of clarity from government. So why are we getting this lack of clarity when they're saying build? Well, I think for a certain part, it's kind of our fault in that as a sector, we're very bad at selling ourselves. We get the big contracts, we do the work, and then the project is live. But we need to actually be able to sell the whole concept of infrastructure back into government and back into the communities. We also have a kind of lack of trust from the public in infrastructure, big headlines of things overrunning and going over budget. But we must try and reduce that risk. And actually, there's a good point from Simon about stopping when you get to that point. Stopping and maybe being a bit public about why you've had to stop, rather than leaving everything right till the back end and getting those bad headlines. And what we do when projects are completed, nobody's kind of actually going back. We might run models on journey time reductions, but what does that actually mean? As Rachel mentioned, what does it mean to the individual? Well, actually, it might mean a father for the first time in his life gets back in home after work to tuck his child in bed for the first time ever. And that is a huge change in somebody's life. Offshore winds, can people actually see them, the turbines when they're built out? Most people would be probably quite happy, but would have been hugely averse to the idea when it started. And that's not taking into the economic side of things, the apprenticeships. What are they doing now, 5 years further down the line? The supply chain and how a big project funded its expansion. And actually, when a project gets to the stage, going back to that funding thing, when it breaks even, very rarely is there a noise about it. I mean, Eurostar broke even years ago, and probably the only people that knew about it were a bunch of teachers in Canada looking at their pension funds. We're not very good at communicating the benefits when things are built out, those success stories. And what that would do would help politicians realize and communicate back policy change. And if we look at certain elements like the byproduct of this, the byproduct would also be a political and a public psyche that would be more into infrastructure. It would also help people be interested in STEM, do degrees in engineering. And we know that we're going to have a huge issue with skill sets, with projects like HS2, Lower Thames Crossing, the new nuclear fleet, all kicking in construction tail end of this decade. And we just don't have the people. So in some ways, it's a bit like going into the Industrial Revolution. We need that same level of pride in infrastructure, civic pride in what we're doing. And Rachel mentioned the digital revolution. That will change how we can actually assess what's needed and the success of things, whether it be AI in planning, engineering usage and demand side generation, GIS phone apps, automotive vehicles, drone deliveries, these kind of things. And all this will also allow us to improve the communications. Social media has always been something that we don't use as a sector, mainly because we're worried it's the kind of battleground of the protester group. Well, unless we're there filling the vacuum with mythbusters about what we do, we can just always lose that battle. And actually, post-COVID, it's probably the only communications platform that's going to be available to us in the foreseeable future anyway. And from that, we will actually get more advocacy for what we do as a sector from the population. And those advocacy stories will then help the politicians, whether it be commuter hours saved on the Jubilee Line extension or Manchester Metro, business rates income from Canary Wharf, all these things, amazing data sets, they really need to be communicated back. But how do we capture them? Well, we've got a number of big players in the room or virtual room today, and we've all been lucky enough to work on some major public schemes. So maybe we could kind of build into the scope of work, some form within maintenance scope of work, some form of legacy officer maybe, who captures the societal benefit data, possibly against some kind of social values KPI. But Rachel was mentioning social values, and maybe we could have some form of matrix there that allows us to communicate back the importance of infrastructure. And of course, we have the big one being net zero. And that every infrastructure project must have some kind of carbon reduction angle to it, otherwise it won't get off the ground. And that's even easier to communicate because that's something that benefits society and the communities, whether they use the piece of infrastructure or not. And in some ways, we have an amazing trump card in that arena because we are a country of innovation and inventors. We've got some great things, and actually here, government policy has made some real good moves. There's a first of the kind grant, for instance, which is driving some fantastic technology. And there's programs like solar powering Network Rail, a company called Riding Sunbeams is doing that all off the ground through the first of the kind grant. But of course, politicians, as Simon alluded to, they get involved. They do have vanity projects. There's a great article today in The Guardian, Simon Jenkins talking about Wilfer and the mess we currently have down here south with our bridges in London. In fact, the ill-fated Garden Bridge actually costs the same amount as it would cost to fix Hammersmith Bridge. And so political involvement often gets bad press, or internally it's thought of as a negative. But if you take it to the bigger level, the policy level, it's crucial for us to know where we can fund things, where the priorities are going to be, and how interfaces can work between different forms of infrastructure. So in short, if we're really going to help with that buy message from the government, surely we need to help them to sell something that the people and communities actually need, and to help them realise they need it. And that is very much us working together with our own communications and playing it back to the politicians. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Again, interesting and valuable points, which we will discuss in a second in the debate section of this webinar. I want to kick things off with a point that you raised just in closing, and that was the involvement of government and the involvement of politicians, because it goes right back to the point that Simon Kirby raised in kicking off the webinar, and that is, how do we ensure that, when the politicians are involved, because they have to be involved, clearly in many cases they are prime funders for major infrastructure, but how do we make sure as an industry, if indeed we can, that politicians actually support what we're trying to do in a way that actually aids more efficient delivery? And I'm going to come to you first, Simon, on that. Just your thoughts on that. You've obviously worked on some really high profile infrastructure projects and have no doubt been involved with politicians on that score. So, what's your reflection, your view on that?
Other than wish I never mentioned it. No. First of all, let's be honest, politicians have a hard job. It's very easy to criticise politicians. Who would want to be a politician at the moment? They've got lots and lots of stakeholders, and we look at this as one optic as the politician. So that's it. And this comment could go actually for a big infrastructure funder from the private sector. They're investing a lot of their personal capital in a program, and they need to get support. And from our perspective, it's really important we get political support for big programs. And to do that, they've got to deal with lots of different stakeholders, both locally and nationally. And if anything, I think the trend now will be more and more localization of those conversations, which is a good thing. So local people have got more impact on their local infrastructure. I think that my point was more around when they create the clear strategy, and we can debate whether that is or isn't good enough, they're holding people to account on that strategy, not getting involved in the delivery. Now, I guess we've also got to ask ourselves, well, why are they getting involved in the delivery? And I think Rachel touched on it, and David did as well, around trust and confidence we can deliver as an industry. And if I reflect back through the first decade of this century, we built a great reputation around things like the Olympics, King's Cross, Blackfriars, Terminal 5, Terminal 2, whatever project you pick. And we've got to be honest with ourselves. In the last, some programs, HS2 has gone over budget, Crossrail's gone late. There's been a number of programs that have dented that confidence. So, in my mind, part of it is us being committed to improvement and being honest with ourselves to improve our industry, and then part of that will back off. But fundamentally, politicians need to understand their part in that game as well. So I think it's not just politicians, we need to be part of that. And it's all about dialogue.
Thanks, Simon. Jamie also made another interesting point earlier on when he said that if you Google, you know, the build stuff, and you see all of the initial highlights, and obviously our Prime Minister with his build, you know, placard in front of him, which, by the way, I've not seen that before in government. So that, I suppose, on one level, that's a plus point. But, you know, we keep our ear to the ground quite closely at Infrastructure Intelligence. And I've not seen another speech by a senior minister or anybody talking about how they're going to do that. And I mean, I'm detecting a little bit of frustration. I know there's obviously bigger fish to fry at the moment with the developments around COVID and everything else. But if I can just ask David, because I know you're close to some, you know, sort of, you know, key infrastructure projects, whether you've detected any additional urgency since that speech that Boris Johnson made in Birmingham, I believe it was, all those weeks ago. Are we seeing an increased intention to get stuff going? What's your view, David?
Yeah, no, yes and no. I mean, I touched on in my my opening bit. We have seen, as 2000, I say, Network Rail, Highways England, the Railway Agency really accelerate schemes. You know, across the UK, we've seen some, you know, some big projects. I think I mentioned the Kirby to Sheffield project with Network Rail. Highways England have been really putting some investment into and making use of the fact that some of the roads, particularly in the kind of early stage of lockdown, were pretty quiet, bringing forward schemes. The EA again brought forward some big investment programs. So yeah, absolutely, we've seen the kind of big government departments do it. But on the flip side, you've seen the kind of more private clients. I mentioned energy, who just still haven't got the clarity and the certainty. So, and I'm not going to mention things like aviation. You know, obviously they're in a kind of real strife at the moment. But if you're from a private background industry at the moment, you've got real challenges ahead. And without the kind of white papers and the strategy and confidence for the next few years ahead, you know, we're not going to see the speed and investment come through. I think also, I'm just picking up on the question you asked Simon there. I think that delivery confidence is massive. I know that's a massive thing, but also what we've got to do, I think Jamie talked about it brilliantly and passionately, that term pride, you know, pride in industry is such a big thing. If we can really bring pride to what we do, we can really attach, you know, what we do to the real outcomes, as Rachel talked about, you know, the decarbonisation, the economic growth, the social levelling up and the progression. You know, this industry all of a sudden becomes on a pedestal that real talent wants to join. And if we can get society view infrastructure in a different way, that links to politics, it links to votes, and you start to the point where actually you get more investment behind infrastructure. So yeah, back over to you, Andy.
Yeah, and just flowing from that and putting this one to Rachel, and again, it's talking a little bit about the politics of this as well, but also, I suppose, with a small and a large P. Is our industry vocal enough, you know, when the industry is being spoken about? And I get that it's a confidence issue as well, and we have to prove ourselves and everything else, but are we vocal enough in actually banging the drum for our own sector? You know, do we do enough on that? And is there a direct link between that and then attracting new people into the sector in the future, Rachel? What's your view on that?
The easy answer to that is, yeah, we're not nearly vocal enough. And when we are vocal, in my view, we sometimes haven't thought enough about our audience. Because I think, I mean, we heard it just now, didn't we? That sort of the need to engage politically, but then what comes with that is the need to understand that the political sort of time frame is always going to be at odds with the infrastructure delivery time frame, because if it was easy to build things in 25 minutes, then it wouldn't be a problem at all. But it's very difficult to build things in 25 minutes. So, you know, it turns out these things take a little while, and obviously sometimes they get a little bit more protracted, I guess, than they even need to be. But I think we have to, well, I guess for my money, I think we have to give a lot more thought to, you know, what is the headline message we're trying to deliver. I think we need not to get sucked in sometimes to a very tactical answer, even if the question is tactical. I think we should always try to give a more strategic answer and remind people why we're doing what we're doing, and that there are the much bigger outcomes to play for. And it's not just about, you know, the mechanics of the construction process, which of course are critical to making the things happen and come into being in the first place. But that's not the point. That's not what we're doing. It's not because we enjoy that kind of thing. It's actually because we're trying to, you know, make things work better in the grand scheme of things. And I think it does feel to me that very often we miss that trick. If I might just offer one other thought, just very briefly on the previous bit of the conversation, the thing around project speed and the visibility of, okay, so now what, you know, and so on. I can't say too much about it, but I've just quickly been Googling and I can see that it is broadly public knowledge. But for those who are aware, that there was a publication that government broadly put out to do with an outsourcing playbook. It's been revised, I think, and came out again in the summertime just a few months ago. There is a degree of work also going on in a sort of a cross-government department sense and trying to sort of bring together different needs and so on at all levels of public sector investment to do with developing a construction equivalent and trying to recognise that there are ways to join things together better, to get more efficient, and really importantly, to shoot for some of those bigger outcomes that we've been talking about through this conversation.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to pick up a couple of questions that we've had coming through, and it's sort of building on that very point that you just finished off on there. John Fox asks us, isn't build going to create the same old problem of politicians ignoring advice and downplaying complexity, cost and time for short-term political gains? We obviously need politicians to engage with longer-term objectives, but how? How do we get them to engage with the longer term, bigger picture? Simon, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as Rachel touched on, clearly, even the start of an election cycle, politicians' radar is at best 5 years and our projects span a lot longer. So clearly it's an issue. I think it's about setting expectations. And if we're confident in industry and politicians, you know, are never going to stand up and say we're going to deliver a new power station or whatever in 2 years or 3 years. You know, set those expectations. A point that we sort of glossed over, and I think, you know, COVID can be used as an excuse for many things. But I think Rachel's point about grateful, we are certainly now as a society much more aware of what everybody does. You know, I don't know how many times people here have thanked the people who picked their recycling up during lockdown, things you would never have done before. And so I think it's about expectations. If we get to government, sell to politicians the benefits, I think they get the big economic impact benefits. And you see now, you know, HS2 creating employment and you can see the positive impact. Let's be honest, politicians like positive things and they need positive things. So we need to be overtly selling what we're doing in a confident way, but setting expectations and not promising everything will change in the next 12 months. Because whilst we're in the middle of COVID at the moment, it feels like it's going to be here forever. It won't. In a year or two, whatever, it'll be behind us. And many of the projects we're talking about will still be in development and still be, you know, needing that political support. So if we get it right, politicians will always see the benefits to the economy and will always see the positives.
Thanks, Simon. Another observation, another question coming through on the chat, and I'm going to put this in the first instance to Jamie, but I'd like everybody's observation on this. Adam Golden has referred to, he said he agreed with everything that you said on policy and social. How do we get better at quantifying social impact of the industry? Adam says that he thinks that we're sometimes guilty of taking a myopic view, and we need to understand the broader impact we have on wider society to really demonstrate the value of infrastructure. I think Rachel and others have already said about during the course of this crisis, infrastructure in many ways has come to the fore. How do we get that across better? And this whole issue of social impact, which I think is very, very important when we look in the context of the levelling up debate. So Jamie, first on that, social impact, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that social impact is a double-edged sword, because you can look at the social values aspect and things like this, but when governments announce a major change in policy, and we're going back to the offshore wind, I think we need to be strong in our education of them as to what the impacts of a policy change like that is. And it isn't just loads of turbines offshore. It's all the associated work, all the reinforcement that's going to be needed in the network transmission. That means new pylons outside somebody's house. And we need to make sure that when they talk about change and societal change for a positive, they also talk about the bigger picture and how all the elements of infrastructure, the complex jigsaw, will be affected by policy change. So there's a social impact there that is a positive, you know, net zero and things like this. But let's also look at it in the whole and talk about the other aspects of social impact, which may actually, for somebody, involve some form of negative side of things. And I think at the moment, politicians obviously just want to talk about the social values, the social impacts on the positive side. But even a negative, that means there's more money being spent on reinforcing the network. Anything will trigger some other form of associated infrastructure, and that's more spend, more build. So there is a positive that they need to talk about, but they just need to be educated about how everything is intertwined so they can tell the full social impact story.
David, just on this issue of social impact, how important is it to an organisation like Turner and Townsend, either when you're bidding for work, when you're actually promoting the job that you've actually done, during the course of the actual work that you're doing, how important is it to you guys?
Huge. It's becoming more important as well. We, I'm sure Simon and Rachel are in the same position, but, you know, when we're facing procurement submissions at the moment ourselves, you know, social impact demonstration of it is absolutely the heart of questions we get now. And, you know, some of the kind of big things we've done recently, you know, social impact has been a heart of decision making, so it is absolutely critical. Also, the way we help clients procure, you know, social impact's been more and more absolutely the heart of, you know, how we help clients make procurement decisions. So it's a huge feature going forward. I think as an industry, we've got to be better at measuring social impact in a consistent, common way. There's some great work done. We've just invested in the social value portal as an organisation to help us really capture now the social value we bring in the projects we're involved in a consistent way. And it's a massive benefit as well as our clients. We're looking internally to our people, actually, you know, for our people to think every week, right, what have I contributed from a non-financial value or social value perspective, whether that's around carbon in a project or it's around creating jobs, you know, apprentice job creation, for example. So yeah, we're finding that it's having a massive impact, but as an industry, you know, we've got to be better at, I think, you know, measuring and capturing social impact in a consistent way.
Thanks, David. Rachel, I know that you have spoken at some length in the past on the impact, the real impact, the lasting impact that infrastructure has on people's lives. I mean, do you think that we're vocal enough around the social impact? Do you think that politicians get it in that sense?
Yeah, so I certainly have. I won't give you the whole speech now. It feels to me we've made some really good progress, I think, in this area over the last, I don't know, couple of years, I guess. It feels like that the bigger social value picture has gone from being something that was perhaps more around, if we're honest, token promises, into something that's actually now about, right, seriously, this is now actually about delivering on those, and exactly, actually, as we were just hearing, about making sure that, you know, if you're going to promise something, you've actually got to be able to measure it and then be able to say whether or not it's actually coming through in practice. But I think there's a huge distance still to go on this. I think the bit where sometimes it gets interesting is that sometimes the project or the program or whatever it is you're dealing with, again, small or large scale, sometimes in its own right, it lends itself to, you know, being able to see that social value in action. The one that springs to mind for me is there's a fair amount of work that we've been doing recently around first mile, last mile connectivity in a transport sense. And the fact that, you know, at the moment, the reason why very often in terms of some of the communities that are less well connected, it's simply about providing a hook into the bigger, for example, transport network and system in order to allow people to suddenly access all kinds of new jobs and opportunities and move around in a totally different way, where previously those options just did not exist for a lot of people. And I think that, it just is one small example of it, but I think that in itself is utterly critical right now to really get to grips with, you know, where are the things that we could do to quite easily spin out a huge amount of social sort of wider benefits for communities where that is the case, all over the country. I think where it perhaps is more difficult is where that link is less direct or less obvious, but I think it's absolutely something we should be thinking about, because across all the things we do, any of the infrastructure sectors you can think about, there absolutely are those social impacts. And I think I would agree also with that comment I think Jamie was just making, that it's not all about positive stuff, it's also about the negatives. You've got to get the balance and the trade-offs, you've got to understand where they are. And I think we have to be open and honest about that, because there's no point pretending that people aren't going to notice. They are absolutely going to notice what those impacts are, and they won't be quiet about it if they feel that it's not in their interest.
Thanks, Rachel. Simon, just turning to you for a second, partly on social impact. I know that the Treasury's Green Book is being reviewed at the moment, and Sarah Coleman's highlighted this in the chat. The Green Book, of course, is the Treasury guidance on how to appraise and evaluate policies, projects and programmes. And Sarah's asking the panellists, how would you guys feed into the review of that Treasury Green Book? What would you like to see come out of that review, if indeed the review goes ahead on time because of all of the COVID stuff and everything else? But what should the industry be arguing for in that, in terms of actually making sure that social impact is actually taken into account? Simon, do you have any views on that?
I could say at the moment, read the IPFA submission that I chaired earlier in the year, but I won't, because that'd be a plug for the IPFA. But I did.
Just done it.
No, seriously, I think, without repeating all the points people have just made, it's about, of course, ultimately it's about a business case, but it's about the bigger societal impacts that I always think at that level, you can almost make the business case what it is. Do we believe in some of the things we're trying to do, like net zero? Of course, how we measure it needs to be improved, etc. So I think it's more around the bigger impact on society, both of the infrastructure itself, which I think we've got a big communications job to do, which Jamie touched on, in terms of why do we need renewable infrastructure in energy or whatever that is, but also the societal impact during construction, the good and the bad, and be honest about both. Rachel's point, people will notice, and it's, we've got to cover all of that. One of the points just touch on that's come up in a few of the comments is, does this conflict of building faster conflict with net zero and conflict with the societal benefits? And for me, I did an interview yesterday, and I said, I don't think we've woken up to this yet as an industry. I really don't. If I look back to when I was in Network Rail probably 15 years ago, there were big debates over safety around the cost and the overhead safety carries. We don't have those debates anymore. Everybody has safety as their biggest priority, and it's kind of in the DNA of all of our businesses. I think net zero needs to be thought about as the same. It's not something you add on and think about sustainability or it is in the DNA of what we do. And if we get that message over, people will say, yeah, this is a good thing. This is about a green agenda. It's not about probably what they do see, which is, diggers and fossil fuel burning and all the bad things that we're trying to get away from. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Simon. Just on that net zero issue, of course, we've been now in the pre-period for the big COP conference in Glasgow, if it hadn't been cancelled because of COVID-19. And there's no question that the eyes of the world would have been on the UK in relation to that issue as a result of that conference. So again, flowing from what Simon just said, I'll come to Rachel first on this issue of net zero. Some people have said during the course of this pandemic, it's made people think in a more holistic way about the environment, about the world they live in. What are we doing to make sure that that's on the agenda, and how do we make sure that it isn't forgotten about in the drive to build, as it were? Sure. Rachel.
No, thanks. So I think this is a really interesting topic, because I think if we hadn't found ourselves in the COVID period, actually, I think we'd still be, very much into the whole piece around net zero carbon. In any case, I think spring 2019, we were absolutely winding up into this. You couldn't listen to the news in the morning without hearing something about that. And what I'm finding fascinating right now is, I think it's fair to say that feeling, if you like, that interest is absolutely still there. Now, I hear also a lot of people saying, we can only have one crisis at once. We can only cope with one thing at a time. I'm afraid it's just not the way the world actually works. I said the other day in a different speaker slot, it's a little bit like buses. You can't predict that you're only going to get sort of one at a time. Sometimes you get more than one, sometimes you get none. And right now, I mean, clearly from a UK point of view, we've got COVID, we've got a small matter of Brexit to deal with, and we've also got this issue to do with our legally binding net zero commitment, legal commitment to be achieved by 2050. Now, where I find this fascinating is, on the one hand, 2050 feels like it's a very long way away. However, when you start to bear in mind that we've got 30 odd years of impact already baked in from the things we've already done, nothing to do with just infrastructure, but there's no doubt infrastructure is a really big part of that. Actually, we need to get our skates on, because we've only got 30 years to get to the point where we've actually achieved net zero. So there's no doubt that this next, handful of years is going to be completely critical, because climate change in the round is going to change the game. So just joining that together with the previous piece around, the Green Book changes and what might be coming forward in terms of the way we appraise projects and so on, I think where it's really tricky, and I wish I had the answers to this, because I wish any of us did, frankly, because it would make life a lot easier. But what's really difficult is that, on the one hand, we need to monetize everything. We need to think about how we monetize carbon. We need to think about how we monetize the social value piece and so on as well, of course, because if you want to build it into a business case, sort of by definition, that has to happen to some extent. But I think we have to realize that these are things that don't lend themselves to being monetized in the way that we're used to monetizing, for example, the safety or the congestion and some of the other pieces that we've been dealing with for a long time. So it is horribly tricky, but I actually think it's probably the most critical thing that we absolutely need to get right in the next, sort of 12 to 24 months, absolutely, because otherwise we will still be having this conversation in that length of time, and we'll have even less time then to really get to grips with it. So no, absolutely, utterly critical across all these different things we're talking about.
David, just from your perspective, in terms of net zero, how engaged and I suppose incentivized on one level are clients on this issue as far as you're concerned? Is it still right at the top of the agenda? Is it high enough up the agenda?
Is it high enough for the agenda? I think it's getting towards the top of the agenda, and I think different sectors within infrastructure are different spaces. If I take the UK water sector, I'd say they're probably ahead. You're talking about certain chief execs of water, we talk about 2030 net zero. I think water's been pretty innovative. I think the regulatory model has driven that, to be fair. We can debate regulatory models, but I think Ofwat have driven a response. So, and I think other infrastructure sectors could probably look at that and learn, actually. So I think it's getting there. We need to go faster. I completely agree with what Rachel said there. We can't be talking about this in 18 months' time. Every month that goes by, a year that goes by is lost time. And as Simon said, it's not either or. It's getting the environmental issues absolutely integrated into the way we think about setting up, delivering and operating infrastructure. And we shouldn't lose the operational bit. We're doing a lot of work on retrofitting at the moment across London. You're retrofitting office space, domestic dwellings, private commercial dwellings as well at the moment, or commercial space. There's an amazing amount of work to do in that. I think if we can somehow, I think as Rachel said, attach, it might sound crude this, but an economic benefit to the environmental situation, or economic benefit to carbon. Firstly, there's an amazing amount of jobs we can create through actually the carbon reduction efforts we need to make, whether it's in renewables or retrofitting schemes. And if you had the ambition that we're going to be real world leaders in this, and therefore the export opportunity, of UK infrastructure to export our capability around the world, I think that's quite exciting ambition. So I think maybe as an industry we look at how we could demonstrate the economic benefits of bringing a real focus on carbon. It might sound crude, but it's probably would be helpful for us as a sector.
Jamie, I know that BECG are across sort of public opinion on different issues, and obviously net zero, we know from what we see in terms of particularly young people's attitudes towards issues, particularly we've seen Extinction Rebellion and everything else. What's your view on how high profile this issue is and where the industry sits in actually dealing with it? Do you have a view on that? Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from a public's perspective, net zero is well, probably not at this very moment in time with COVID, but I agree with Rachel, it hasn't dropped off the radar and it's still up there. I think one of the things people are starting to realise, and we've got the likes of David Attenborough, certainly helping along, is that 2050 is a target, but there's things happening now. There is things, extinction and everything else going on. And realistically, I think what we need, and the public are seeing this, is an element of realism. We need it's an emergency. We need a short-term solution, and we can't wait. And we're seeing a lot of public and feedback to that. I think a prime example is the exit strategy we're now seeing policy giving to the fossil fuel industry, and a total shift, a total policy change on carbon capture and storage and utilisation as it is now. And that is something actually we're getting a lot more awareness of in the public. They understand that that's okay, it's not brilliant, we're still using nasties, but the technology behind it, people are starting to understand and seeing that by giving the oil companies and the gas companies, who have the money after all, a way of utilising their assets a little bit further, it might buy us a bit more time. And the public are aware there needs to be something done now, and that 2050 isn't when we start doing things. So my own view, to answer the question, is yes, the public are aware of it. There's been a shift in their understanding of what is involved, and that's been hugely beneficial. And I agree with Rachel, I don't see that dropping off because of COVID. If anything, COVID has highlighted it. Everyone using their bikes, everyone knows that we've gone fossil free for so many months during COVID. And it's a terrible thing to say, but it is one of the silver linings of COVID, is the awareness of net zero and how achievable it is.
Well, someone in the chat, thanks, Jamie. Someone in the chat said, never waste a good crisis. And obviously that's been said in more than one context, around this particular issue. And just throw this one over to Simon. Simon, how important do you think that the whole net zero debate will be around I'm not going to call it the build agenda. I'm going to call it the deliver agenda. Another 3 words again, and I've got another 3 buzzwords coming up as well towards the end in the last 10 minutes of this webinar, which I'll share with you in a second. But how important do you think that is? And, looking at it from a hard-nosed point of view, how do we... I know it's not just about monetization, because this is about the future of the planet we're talking about here. Forget about webinars and Zoom and Teams and God knows what else if there's no planet left. But how do we, sort of get that across? And how important do you think that is in terms of future infrastructure delivery? Simon?
I think it's the most important thing. Build. It's a rhetoric. It's here at the moment. There'll be another one in 6 months. The programs we're talking about are 10, 15, 20 years long. As Rachel said, last year we saw, I think almost an exponential increase in awareness about climate change. The voters of 10 years away will care more passionately about climate change than anything else at the time when we're building and delivering these programs, and the politicians get that. So I think it's right up there. At the moment, clearly it isn't seen as the biggest priority because there is more immediate national issues, but we'll get beyond that. And what will the voters of 10 years' time care about most? Probably climate change.
Thanks, Simon, for that. Just picking up a couple of other questions in the chat. And we've got a question here, a specific... And, well, there's a couple of questions on planning, which I'm not going to ask those questions on planning because A, we've only got 10 minutes left, and B, we do have an event coming up around the planning system later in our autumn series. So we will get to that. But I've got a couple of points here, and I think it speaks to this, I suppose, crucial issue about how the industry gets its message across to opinion formers, really, and to government. And I just want to ask, each of the panelists, really, what is the role for industry bodies, for industry media organisations like Infrastructure Intelligence, even in articulating the sentiments of the industry, to politicians. And I'm thinking all politicians here, not just national politicians. The whole local agenda is really important, isn't it? When we look at devolution and the increasing importance of that. So, you know, how important are, you know, these structures, magazines, so on and so on, that we have at our disposal to get the message across? And will the industry be eager enough to, I suppose, get on its, you know, hind legs in one way and speak out on some of these on some of these key issues? And I'm going to come first on that to Rachel, because I know that Rachel historically is never shy of speaking out on issues in relation to the industry itself. Rachel, what's your view on that? How do we get more vocal?
I don't know what you're suggesting. I think I might be insulted. Anyway, no,
that was a
compliment. As I said, it's fine. As I said earlier on, no, I think there's a really critical role for everyone to play here. I don't think it's just about industry bodies. I don't think it's just about sort of the media setup and so on. I think we have to all somehow find ourselves on a similar bandwagon and actually start rolling in a similar direction. We're all violently agreeing here, aren't we, right now, in terms of the need to do this. So I think there is a really important role here in terms of explaining ourselves better, first of all. And as I said earlier on, thinking about the audiences that we're speaking to and adapting that message so that actually it gets heard, as opposed to just kind of talking to ourselves or just kind of endlessly bleating about something which actually people just don't quite understand why we're saying it in the first place. I think there's another angle though here actually, and it's something which it frustrates me because there's so much activity that goes on, and yet somehow we haven't really landed it in sort of a mass form, which is just around, it's around the wider public side of things. You know, if we want to influence the way that things happen, the decisions that get made, the urgency of investment and the level of investment and so on, we've got to make this something which, in general, the wider public sees, the wider public cares about, and that they understand. And it's really not that difficult, because actually if you do explain what we do and all the rest of it to people, if we explain all the big things around, you know, we're really working hard around the big picture items, whether it's to do with, you know, the future of the human population on the planet. And by the way, I think the planet will be just fine. It's us who won't be if we don't get to grips with this carbon issue, but there we go. But also the piece around, you know, equality and diversity and levelling up in the biggest possible sense. It's really not hard to get people on side. And what we need to do is, I think, be far less technical in that domain, and just think about, you know, what is it they need to know? Why is it difficult? And that applies to everything, you know, whether it's all of us going about our daily lives, or whether it's everything from influencing school kids, or whether it's to do with, you know, taking part in community discussions, that kind of thing. There's masses we could be doing there. And somehow, I suspect, just because it's all a bit scattergun and there's masses of it, but somehow it's just not landing with impact, all that time and effort and energy goes in, and yet we're not getting the payback. So a bit of thought around that, I think, would pay dividends really, really quickly, and could actually transform the way that we then can go about things and feel that level of respect actually being played back to us.
Thanks, Rachel. David, just on this on this issue briefly, how do you think that the industry itself can get that message across and can really sort of raise its profile, you know, at this particular time around this whole delivery issue?
I completely agree with what Rachel was saying there. I mean, firstly, simplicity of message, and we'll probably do with Jamie's help on this, but, you know, simplicity of message is absolutely key. You know, what are our 3 words? I use, inside my team, my business, I use lower carbon, drive economic growth, drive social levelling up, we're going to call it. And I would love to find a way of simply measuring those things. You know, CLC did some great work some years ago around 33% less cost, 50% more exports, etc. Quantified what we're trying to do. If we had that for carbon, economic growth and social value, and stuck to them, and whether you're my business or any of the businesses involved here or people listening, we all measured similar things, talked about it. I think Rachel's point, get into society, get into schools, get into really sell our message and talk about it in a consistent way, and then people will start to believe it. And finally, there are a lot of industry bodies. I'm co-chair of Constructing Excellence, so you know, we're one of those, and we've done I think some good work, and the CLC have started some good work in trying to channel things together. We've got to keep that going. You know, in some ways maybe rationalise things, but all make sure we're heading the same direction with the same message. So that'd be my view, Andy.
Thanks, David. Jamie, just your view on this very briefly, because we are running out of time, and I want to bring Simon back in to end the event. You know, in a simple way, how do you think the industry should be getting its message across on this issue at the present moment in time and making people listen, really?
Yeah, I think we just need to keep it simple, as was said, and talk about what infrastructure improvement enables. And I think the top one still has to be net zero. We can go on about social mobility and other things, but at the end of the day, net zero is top of the agenda. And infrastructure enables the ability to hit those net zero targets. And as I mentioned before, the beauty of net zero as a story, it isn't just then the infrastructure user, it's society as a whole that benefits from that improvement that's put in place by that project. So I would say enabling net zero has to be the message. It's key, it's simple, and it works across the board.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I'm just going to bring Simon in now to ask him a similar question, really. How do you think that the industry can basically, not just raise its profile, but get people to listen and to understand the benefit that we actually bring, particularly around this issue of delivery? I suppose it is delivering, isn't it, in that sense?
I guess wouldn't want to repeat what everyone said, which I agree with. I think it's about going direct to people in a language they understand. I mean, you asked about what can things like organisations like infrastructure intelligence do. I've got a 17 and a 23-year-old. Shock horror, they don't subscribe to NC or infrastructure intelligence. They're in a different place. So we have to go in their language and get to them. And I think we've all done it. We've all been to colleges and schools to talk about what we do. And people think, wow, that's amazing. I didn't have any idea people did that sort of thing, because they only see construction sites. So I think it comes back to the diversity question as well. How do we get the best talent we can into our industry? So it's going out to areas that we don't attract people from now and talking in a different way, and be joined up as well as an industry, which we're probably a bit fragmented on.
Thanks very much, Simon. We've run out of time, sadly. I said I had a three-word buzzword phrase, and our one for today, particularly to highlight the rest of our Infrastructure Intelligence live series of events, is browse, look and book, because the final two, according to Matt Hancock, have got to rhyme, of course. So browse, look and book, and check out the link that I've just put in the chat that lists all of our Infrastructure Intelligence live events. And I think that the point that Simon just made in finishing there about a layer of people is really important. And one of the things that we're looking to do in this series of events is to go beyond some of the people that we maybe would normally look to attract. And that's why we're looking at future events. We've got a mayor's roundtable in a couple of weeks' time. We're also looking at the green recovery issue, and we'll be having some interesting speakers on that question as well. Probably not just from our industry either, to create that debate, because I think we need to be taking the debate and into a wider sort of layer of society, I suppose. But also we need to be hearing those views as well, and not just being in our own bubble on these particular issues as well. So we'll be back on Tuesday with the first of our In the Spotlight interviews with Sir John Armitt, no less, who I know is raring to go on a whole range of issues. So make sure you register for that one, and do send us your questions for that as well, because we want to give John a very good discussion and debate. I nearly said grilling there. He's not going to be grilled. We'll be giving, we'll have a really good session with Sir John. Just in concluding, I'd just like to thank Simon Kirby, David Weisel, Rachel Skinner, and Jamie Gordon for their time this morning and for their insights. Really appreciated all that you've said, and look forward to hearing from you in the future. And finally, just like to thank our strategic partners for all of these events, BCG for their support. Thank you very much indeed. And just wish everyone a happy Friday, and hope you have a really good weekend during the course of these ever-changing sort of restrictive pseudo-lockdownish times. I hope you're keeping safe, and I hope you're keeping well. It's goodbye from me and goodbye from our panel. Thanks very much for joining us, and see you next Tuesday. We even got a collective bye there. Bye. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.